Hi, welcome. Thank you so much for coming today and sticking around despite the sunny weather. I'll try and make this interesting. I'll try and get through this as quick as possible as well, so we can have hopefully some time for discussion about what this means to you and in your particular context. So this is briefly what I'm going to cover today, going over a little bit of background in student engagement, which is actually sort of how we got to Learning Gain, particularly in a policy space, and see where we get to in terms of what that looks like when we actually use it within our institutions. Many of you, hopefully, are very familiar with the Quality Code, and this is often how student engagement has kind of been situated in the UK context. It's what I would sort of term a representative form of student engagement. For a lot of institutions, that means you put students on all the committees, you have student representative systems, and students participate in quality through those means, often by kind of a student representing the voice of lots of other students. And that's contrasted with the way student engagement has been talked about for about the last 15 years or so in the US, which takes much more of an individual approach to student engagement, covering how each individual student engages with his or her own learning, but also what the institution does to support the student in doing that. So it's not necessarily a polar opposite to the representative form, because what would students representing their learning represent about except the kind of individual experiences, but it gives a very different flavor to when we're talking about student engagement. When we want to know what works, what do we want students to engage about? Well, it turns out we don't actually need to do more and more research. This is quite an old reference from 1987, but I don't really think we've gone much further than this. Maybe because we kind of got some home truths a long time ago, but we know these are the aspects that, particularly when you talk about undergraduate education, they come in new flavors. We might add MOOCs, we might add new data, we might add new courses, but the kind of fundamental basics of what makes for a good higher education experience are these. And we've had lots of people working on this. We have decades and decades of research that show this, so we know what kind of the process things are to get to where we want to go. It's just they're not that easy to do. And when we try and create really big systems, really big institutions, we often lose sight of the scale and sometimes forget some of these really important points. But I think if we think of this as the grounding for where we're going with Learning Gain, we know kind of how to get there. But how do we know kind of who's doing it well? What does it look like? How do we maximize? Are some people doing this in a more efficient or more effective way? I think it's kind of the grounding for where we're going with Learning Gain. So I'm going to leave this picture of a rudimentary sausage making factory as kind of a placeholder for the political process for how we got from those principles of good education through to designing in the US the National Survey of Student Engagement, work with your own Alex Buckley at Strathclyde, developing the UK Engagement Survey, the UK version of it, which led to a lot of questions of actually, is that data sufficient as sort of a quality metric that we could use? Which led to questions of, well, how do we have evidence that the process measures covered by those principles that I mentioned earlier, can they be mapped onto engagement data, and can we use that as maybe an improvement on things like satisfaction data? And that kind of turning around in this sausage making factory, well, let's maybe measure UCAS and some of the outcomes and see whether that works. We don't need to worry about the outcome data, we can just use the UCAS data. Again, sausage making, several different university ministers, we ended up with sets of pilot projects on Learning Gain. At the same time, this notion of the teaching excellence framework came into fore, particularly in the English context, although spreading not only throughout the UK, but also getting tentacles into other countries in kind of a dangerous way. So that's where we're at. If you want to know more about how we got there, come and speak to me sometime. But I want to jump right into what are we actually talking about when we talk about measuring Learning Gain. And there's been a lot of research into this, but one of the fundamental questions I had some ministers come ask me a few years ago, if Learning Gain's the kind of essential bit of higher education, why haven't we cracked this yet? Well, it turns out it's not actually that easy to measure learning gain when we really try and measure it precisely. Lots of different challenges. Number one, really difficult to get students to fill out lots of extra tests and surveys. So when it's not part of their course and you think you're trying to do something in addition to everything else they're asked to do, not easy to get them engaged. Motivating to get them to actually put a lot of effort into difficult tests. A real big challenge. They found this in Brazil when they decided to do some large-scale assessments of all students at the end of the degree. The really smart students realized they didn't have to do it. Kind of skewed the whole national picture. A lot of the work that's been done on this was done in the US, which has much more liberal arts degrees, so they kind of have a general education outcomes that they're working with, which really don't map well onto the English subject-specific higher education context, and would map in different ways in the Scottish system. But again, not based on this, when you design something that's fit for purpose for the US, doesn't mean you can just plunk it down in other countries. So quite a lot of challenge there. Huge issue with comparability of entry and exit measures. I know particularly key an issue in the Scottish sector with multiple different entry points. So when you try and say, well, how much have you gained? Well, it depends a lot on where you started from. And when you have multiple different qualifications, multiple different pathways, it's not easy to kind of say, well, we took people in at this point and left them at that point. Reliability of student self-reports. This might come as a shock to everyone in the room, but men always report learning more than women. And that is the same across all of the kind of characteristics. So mapping onto things like social privilege, whether we talk about race, ethnicity, social class, some groups of people report more than others. So a big challenge if you just ask students how much have you learned, you're not going to get kind of the same response from all students. And then issues of data protection, data sharing, research ethics that I'll get into later. And this is the kind of crux of why I think we're actually talking about this. It's not easy, it's not straightforward, we're obviously not going to get simple answers, but we're using data instead of really good learning gain metrics. It's not that we go, is it learning gain or not? We're using data for all sorts of things. And what we're using as kind of our proxy measures for learning gain right now are largely student satisfaction and now graduate salaries. That's how we're measuring learning. And I think collectively, everyone in this room, we could do a little bit better than that. So it's to say we're never going to get it right. We're never going to solve it. It's never going to be pretty, but it can be a lot better than where we are right now in sort of capturing what it is that students are gaining from their time in higher education. So that's why I'm here today, because I really believe in that. And hopefully, I can get messages to all of you to think of how can we, as a sector, start to work on some of these metrics to get better from that as a starting point, rather than thinking about some of the negative sides of what it could or couldn't be used for. So this piece of work, a few years ago, HEFGE decided to fund a series of pilot projects covering different approaches to measuring learning gain to see sort of, well, let's think about how we can measure it, what sort of happens when we do it, what do we learn, and then see kind of what comes out from it. Not the clearest policy directive, but we're working with what we have. That's the kind of reality of doing this. So sets of projects looking at learning analytics, so building on what Rebecca was talking about this morning. How do we use some of those metrics that are used in these different ways? And things like dashboards, is that an answer? Along with grades, how do we use the attainment data that we already have? Self-reported surveys, asking students things like how they spend their time. Trialing a few different forms of standardized tests, seeing how that works. And then some projects that threw a whole bunch of methodological things in a bucket and kind of said, well, let's see what comes out. There's also two kind of sister projects, a national mixed methodology learning gain project, so sort of like the extra project funded by HEFGE itself, where they were running a trial of some questions. And then a project called HELGA, which is sort of saying, can the government look at in a big data approach, all the data sets they have, link some of this together and see if they can actually find some interesting correlations or causations of tracking students using all the linked data sets that the government has on individuals to come up with some measures of learning gain. when we talk about measuring learning, so it's not easy, it's not straightforward. This kind of fundamental question, well, what do we really mean when we talk about measuring learning gain? Well, it turns out it's quite a philosophical question to ask. Because it depends on what you think higher education is for. It depends on what do you think students should learn? Why do you think they're going to higher education? Well, it comes to, which, you know, is deeply personal for a lot of people. It's also deeply political for a lot of people. And it has a lot of consequences on what you think it's for. But you have to start to answer that question when you want to think about, well, what is it you're going to measure? If you think it's about contributing to the future economy, then you would go down things that might lead to salary data, for example. If you think it's about building a sense of lifelong learning or a love of a discipline, you would pick different things to measure when you think about what you think the purpose of learning is. So this has been quite interesting in the projects in that it's emerged out that some people thought they kind of didn't need to answer this question, but it turns out you do. And that's part of the debate around learning gain, is thinking, what do we want higher education to be for? What's valued? What do we want graduates to be able to know and do? Is it employers' job to answer that? Or do students get to own that as what they want to be able to do when they go on to work? So a lot of questions of who should be involved in answering these questions, which then goes back to sort of how we want to start to think about measuring learning gain from the beginning. A lot of questions about learning gain thinking, how do we make sure students are learning a sufficient amount, particularly in a system that just keeps growing and growing and growing? So it's how do we deal with these tensions of widening participation, widening access, growing a system, but ensuring that there's a sufficient level of quality and baseline standards are being met. So that's some of the putting the box around learning gain that we're trying to deal with. So we've answered our philosophical question, what is it that we want to measure? Now we go into the fact that actually students don't start at the same point. They come in with a whole host of social characteristics, educational preparation that put students at really different places. So not only do they start at different points, the characteristics they come in with influence their time in higher education. And we know loads of research that proves this. So not only, you can't just say, well, now we've accounted, in our statistical model, we accounted for sort of input, and then you think that's taken care of, because it actually feeds into the whole educational process, kind of further complicating matters. But you really need to take account of the input measures and what students know. There was some concern when the learning gain pilot projects were first mooted that, well, all you get is a bunch of students, just tell them all to fail the test at the beginning and then work really hard on it at the end. To kind of acknowledge, but also some, legitimate pressure from some institutions that says, well, what if we're not very good at learning gain because we bring in really clever students? And is there kind of a ceiling on your learning? So we can only teach them this much because they come in knowing so much. But some people are saying, oh, hey, we bring in really not very good students. So we've got huge potential for learning gain because they don't know anything when they come in. So we can have the off the charts for learning gain. So there's a lot of tension in sort of how do you account for students' incoming characteristics. And when you do this across the sector, what you find is some institutions don't even have entry requirements. Or students come in with portfolios, or they do performances. And so it's not very easy to sort of put those on a scale and say, well, we can judge you from where you came in. But we have to do some of that when we measure learning gain. When we think about what is it fundamentally that we're measuring, in analyzing the huge breadth of topics that are covered in the projects, I've come up with sort of a three-part model. The first one being effective measures. So this is sort of what students feel. A lot particularly around this idea of confidence, building students' confidence, whether it's their own kind of internal confidence or confidence in approaching new problems or doing research. Resilience is a big one. A lot of people have issues with the term resilience and its kind of authenticity as a concept. But that notion of what resilience is trying to get at. So a lot of these effective measures link on to what employers want in graduates. Students that have lots of these characteristics. Different behavioral measures, so these are kind of things students do. So it's not that these are outcome measures in themselves, but they're part of students who do these. What are the outcomes of participating in these types of activities? A lot of this, how do you analyze ways students learn, drawing in again on the learning analytics, or students doing work placements. We know there's a lot of benefit, but how do we start to kind of quantify it quite specifically? And then the third area are various cognitive measures. Interestingly, a lot of people thought, well, this is what I thought learning gain was, just the thinking side. But when it turns out, when you actually say, well, what are the outcome measures, it turns out people want all that sort of behavioral and affective measures as well as the confidence. And interestingly, it was a lot of policymakers and government who were like, well, we just really want the cognitive stuff. And you go, interestingly, it's the employers who go, we don't just want the cognitive side, we want the other stuff. That's actually what really matters when we employ graduates. So we ended up kind of with the government on the side of like the purely disciplinary academics for once. With the whole, it was like, how are we friends together? We've never been friends together. So we end up with this multiple, and a lot of the projects, what they're doing is looking at the interrelationship between these affective, behavioral, and cognitive measures and the different outcomes that students get. And then when we try to look at sort of what I would call the outcome measures. So if we kind of think, well, we know we have various inputs, and then we have these sort of things we want to measure going on in that kind of black box of higher education. Well, what are the kind of outcomes we're looking at? Well, what most projects kind of did was say, well, employability skills, employable graduates. And I was like, well, what do you mean by that? Because that's kind of a funny word. We all think we know what it means. But actually, when you unpack what they were talking about, it came back to different combinations of the affective, behavioral, and cognitive measures. That's what employability skills are. Do you have confidence? Do you have experience? Do you know certain things? Can you do certain things? So when we think of the outcome measures, the question then says, well, what are the outcome measures we want to pick? And you go, well, we have some. They exist. We have grades. We have progression data. It's not doing the job, which is why we're asking questions about learning gain. So we can't just use those data points, because as we know, things like grade inflation keep kind of cropping up. And when we really try and answer this question, we go back to that fundamental questions of value. What is it that we think higher education's for? And it's answering that question, which is the kind of outcome measure when we think about learning gain. Is it critical thinking skills? Do you think that's the kind of essential bit? Or is it generic graduate skills that everyone should be able to, roughly communicate effectively? Is it sort of a disciplinary mastery? Is it developing employability skills or something a bit more holistic than that? And if you really think that, well, that's what I want, then how do you map back and think, well, how would I measure that? How would I quantify that? Or how would I measure that in a qualitative way? It's not that it has to be a number, but how would I account for that happening to know if it happened or not? Or more, if it happened more here or more there, for example. So that's the kind of process of measuring learning gain. It's not easy. But I think what these pilot projects shows is there's a huge variety of ways to go about trying to do it. And one of the things about trying to do it is seeing, well, what actually works when we think about it. So using learning gain data. So even if we can measure all of this, what do we do with it? Which has actually been part of the pilot projects and evaluating them. So I've listed up here a variety of levels of use. And what I want you to do is for the next 20 seconds, talk to the person next to you and say, you talk about in your particular context, which of these levels do you use learning gain data? Could you use learning gain data? Okay, go, chat, quick. absolutely hate to cut you off because that sounded absolutely brilliant. But how many of you don't see what you talked about represented here now? Do we have some more in addition to some of this? So have a look through these. We have, informed choice for students. We have, allowing student data for students to reflect. That's like what Rebecca was talking this morning in relation to learning analytics, pedagogical enhancement. You can use it for sort of managing your course. Okay, I'll let you hold if you've got extra things, and we can come to them. I think one of the things that's emerged out, you can tell me what you think of this analysis. People seem to like to use learning data for these purposes. People are happy when it's for current students to kind of use data, reflecting on their learning, see where they're positioned, track their progress, learn from peers. Academics are happy for sort of classroom enhancement. Did that workshop session work well? Which students gained what from my different activities? If I tried flipping my classroom, did the students learn more or not? Enhancing institutional services, kind of target those students who really don't know what they want to do after graduation for career services interventions. Employers talking about what they really want from graduates, what are the essential skills in certain disciplines. People go, yeah, we're happy with learning gain used in those ways, at sort of those levels and for those purposes. But people seem to think it's a very sinister thing. Very dark arts emerge. When you start to say, oh, you mean you want to put it in a league table? Oh, you want students to start to select things? Oh, that starts to sound like, we're being benchmarked against others. Oh, this seems now we're being ranked on this. I don't like that. Oh, I don't want the senior management to use this. I'm happy to kind of improve my own classroom, but I don't want to be, once they get their grubby hands on it, then they're going to start, firing the people who aren't teaching their students much, or, moving students around the institution. When it's done cross-institutionally, everyone goes, well, that's fine if it's kind of kept amongst us, but don't give it to the senior people to do that, because then bad things will happen. So even amongst some of the pilot projects, they only agreed to participate with the proviso that the other institutions in their own projects wouldn't see each other's data. Because they were like, just bad things are going to happen if we do that, once we go down that path. If my VC gets a hold of this, that'll be the end of things. So it's very interesting that it seems lovely and how we would do really good pedagogical work in some contexts, and then part of the evil empire when it's used in other contexts, even though it's all the same thing. And you go, wouldn't you want the senior managers to maybe make decisions off learning? Where are students learning? Who's teaching well? Shouldn't that be kind of part of the currency of higher education? But there's a perception that it's not going to be used in that way. So that's why I think we get a lot of contention around learning gain as a topic. Some people want a lot of it. Some people say, just make it go away. I'd rather not use it at all, than the potential negative side of it. Particularly this idea of the government using it when it comes to things like quality assurance, assuring systems, sectors, and so on. So, when we think about the different uses and what we want to do, what do we want to achieve with learning gain? Why does it seem negative in some ways and positive in some others? And I think it comes down to these questions of, well, what is success in higher education? Particularly in the English context, there's a lot of discussion right now that it's about leveling that playing field. Issues of social mobility, which some people think is fine if that means everyone moving up together. But what does it mean some groups of people moving up more than others? And that's where we get a lot of kind of deeply political concerns, questions coming in, relating to degree outcomes. Is it just that final mark that's a sign of success, or is it something else? Is it the amount of effort that students put in? Which for some people, they go, well, I might have worked really hard and got a 2-2, and for me, that might be amazing, because I've got caring responsibilities, I've got a job. That was a huge achievement for me, the relative effort I put in. For another student, that might be, wow, you really shouldn't have gone to higher education in the first place if you ended up with a 2-2. So a lot of issues around that. Employment. One of the challenges of things like salary data being used. For a lot of people, that's not what they make their employment decisions on or their higher education decisions on. So a big concern for a lot of students is they might want what to them they call a good job, but what for a lot of people isn't necessarily a high-paying job. So how do we start to capture that with what students are gaining from their time in higher education? Are they gaining the skills that they want, not necessarily the type of skills that someone else says, I think this is a sign of success of higher education? So how do students have a sense of ownership and agency in this? And this question of success is answered completely differently depending on the audience and different aspects of that audience. Some students, they just want to know, what is the job that's going to pay the most amount of money? And I want to sign up to that one. But for some students, they very actively don't do that, or they can't. And some of this might not necessarily be linked to what institutions do, but it would be completely set by labor market factors outside. If the government decides to raise nursing salaries, does one institution suddenly skyrocket up the charts just because they have a bunch of nursing students? They haven't taught them any differently. They just make more money now. Or less is probably the case. But I think what I really want to try and capture is how learning gain can be used for enhancement. It's got these different purposes, but I think some things kind of a bit unintended, but I think what the pilot projects have certainly shown is there's a lot of ways it can be used for improvement and enhancement. Absolutely brilliant case studies and examples of how it can be used for supporting student learning. Personalized learning data, dashboards. I think, again, they have huge potential, but they require an enormous amount of information, advice, guidance, counseling for students to make sense of them. A lot of this data gets really complex, and students you can't just kind of hand it to them and be like, here's a whole bunch, now go. So it's not necessarily that this is cheap, but it can be hugely influential and developmental for students. One of the advantages that was shown in research in developing the UK engagement survey is if you design instruments based on those 7 principles I mentioned early on of good practices, completing the instrument itself can be a reflective pedagogical tool. And that it gets students to think about these effective educational practices and behaviors that we know are linked to positive outcomes. So just by completing it, they go, oh, how often do I ask a question in class? Maybe I should. How much time do I spend studying each week? Maybe I should do a little bit more. So they can be useful depending on what sort of questions you ask. It can help students kind of prompt them to reflect on how they're learning and how they spend their time. Examples through some of the projects on evaluating classroom interventions. So in East Anglia, they used different learning gain projects to evaluate flipped learning sessions, and actually found out that one lecture, he tried flipping all of his sessions, running them all flipped. As like, this is flipping classroom is brilliant, so we'll just flip it all over the place. Actually, what he found out, it was a bit too much for the students, and it was a bit too much for him. So through kind of testing and doing this conscientious evaluation, found out, flipping about half the sessions was really nice and engaged, but actually doing all of it was a bit too much. And also different types of peer learning, you actually get a sense of, well, what works? So this kind of shows that individual academics can start to do some of this on their own. It doesn't have to be part of some big project. You can start to think, well, how am I evaluating what students are gaining from certain lectures, certain lessons, certain interventions, certain pedagogical approaches? Does it work for some students more than others? Plymouth University's project, they embedded research in teaching. And came up with a whole host of ways to capture what students were gaining from that as an activity. Really interesting to think about what that meant. They were doing this at both the University of Plymouth and with a bunch of HE and FE partner colleges that feed into the university. So what does this look like across a whole breadth of institutions? Enhancing the course experience. So this draws on a lot of the fundamental research that we've learned about education, which is this kind of module mania that happens especially in big universities. A lot of academics don't even know the other modules that students are taking when they take the module they teach, or that they take before or after. They go, I just teach, history, UK, 1850 to 1890. I don't know what they learned before. I assume it's earlier. I don't know what they learn after. I assume it's later. But I don't track. And which completely bonkers, because students don't experience their education module by module. And in fact, they don't experience it in the courses it's offered like that. They experience the modules they're taking at the same time together, because they live at one moment in time. We haven't figured out how to break that one yet. So, you know, it's a way to kind of start to think, well, how do we map onto the student's learning experience as it happens to the student, not as it happens administratively or based on how I teach it. And in the learning analytics space, a lot of institutions have been able to find, you know, bottlenecks and pinch points of students' progress through. And a lot of research actually drawing on work done in the US, successful pathways where students have more choice. So in some courses, students have more choice about what they choose, and you can basically find there are some pathways to success and there are some pathways to failure, depending on the order that students take certain modules. Some institutions have in fact found that, you know, there was a third-year module that really needed to be offered in the first year, because when they mapped what students were learning, they weren't getting some of that fundamental knowledge they needed early on. And you can see a lot of work related to this has been done over the years with medical curricula, where it turns out the best way to do it probably isn't spend 2 years doing completely theory and then go into a hospital and go chop up a bunch of people. You know, despite that being how the medical curriculum was run for eons and eons. Now they're like, oh, it's actually a bit better to kind of mix it up as we go along. And you can see how sort of measuring learning gain can be a way how you could start to analyze how that's happening. Target institutional initiatives. Really interesting projects done at the University of Reading and the Open University, looking large scale across whole institutions on different attainment gaps. Finding across courses, these absolutely brilliant charts that were done at the University of Reading. Some courses, first year, you know, attainment gaps looked like this. By the end, they'd closed. Some stayed the same. And what it did was, it's not that that data tells you the answer, but it starts the conversation. Turns out actually those gaps seem to stay or get bigger in a lot of science disciplines. And they tend to shrink in the humanities. And the data doesn't provide the answer, but you come up with different hypotheses that then you can kind of start to explore. One theory was that in a lot of humanities subjects, what you essentially do is your assessments are all about writing essays. And what you do is you start off with different essay writing skills, and by the end, everyone's more or less figured out how to write an essay. Whereas when you have multiple forms of assessment, you don't have that same closing of the pathway. So it starts the conversation at a local level with data that actually means something to the people on the ground. And get some people starting to think, what is it that I'm doing in my teaching that might lead to some of these gaps happening? And some of that has to be done on a large scale to understand how it compares across others. Lots of interventions, particularly around career services or student support, where you go, if we have limited budget, how do we know who to target? Are there certain groups of students who really don't know what they want to do, who would be right for certain types of interventions, and how can this data be used to kind of help support students in certain ways? One of the outcomes of this kind of targeting support data was that a lot of students find it hugely helpful to know that about 50 to 25% of the students on their course also don't know what they want to do when they grow up, even in the third year. And a lot of students sit alone, and actually a lot of the mental health challenges, our students feel they're alone in having these feelings. They think everyone else has it sorted and has an internship lined up, you know, at a big accounting firm or a bank or something, and they're the only one who doesn't know what's going on. And they actually find it really reassuring to just know that lots of other students are in the same boat. So it's amazing how some of this can bizarrely be used in some of those ways. When we talk about evaluating learning gain data, this is the kind of not so hot side. Really across the projects, even when they've tried to embed it in institutions, there's a lack of consistent use of existing data for enhancement. Probably why it's been an enhancement theme, because we know it's something we need to improve. And it's a universal, and that is consistent use at any of those levels I described. You know, you might try and evaluate something once, you might get a little pot of funding and try something off, but it's not kind of done consistently. An interesting point that some colleagues pointed out, as some of this data, it might make a lot of sense at the local level, but as it gets moved up committee structures and systems, it kind of starts to lose what it was about in the first place. Loses its nuance and, then gets turned around and used for all sorts of kind of nonsensical things. Historically, a lot of this research has been done, particularly institutional research, about students. So it's doing analysis about students, about their data points, but not bringing students into the conversation, not asking them what it means or what they could do with it. And across institutions, a lot more effort put into reporting things, pretty charts, lots of lines, I used color. But not a lot on analysis. So what does it mean? So you'll just get endless reams of things that go to a committee and everyone kind of looks at it, but there's not even one so what? It's just like, well, here you go. And it's like, well, what are we supposed to do with that? I mean, that's all lovely, but the so what? And I think there's been a lot more effort put into, no, we're going to collect it, we're going to report, we've ticked all the boxes, we can tell everyone we've got these amazing procedures for, reporting data, but it's not really used for a purpose. It's not leading to changes in behavior. It's not leading to new questions being asked. But the answer is some institutions have started to get on this, what I call institutional embeddedness. When you actually start to get that institution-wide direction setting. When you kind of say, as an institution, these are some of our values, these are some of our purposes, we're going to use some of this data to actually see, are we really delivering on what it is we are trying to do here? How is it embedded within internal quality enhancement purposes? How does this lead to, evaluation students fill out at the end of modules? Planning rounds, is this linked with budgeting? Or, oh no, that's all based on other things. Is learning gain over here? It needs to be connected into those systems to be useful. I picked up this phrase from Twitter. Twitter's amazing. The learning and teaching and HE chats. This concept of actionable insights. Don't present data if you don't have any actionable insights off of it. And if you have a meeting about it, pull out some. Even if it's one, even if it's tiny, that's better than nothing. So each of you, write down your actionable insight. Think about, well, what am I going to do in relation to this? And start to ask that of the data that either you're in charge of analyzing, reporting, presenting on, listening to. Ask of others, what are we going to do about this? And when we think about, well, what do we do with this? Where do we start? I think the question is actually, well, what's the end point? What is it we're trying to achieve? And how do we kind of work backwards from that to think of, well, how do we design something that captures the data that allows us to evaluate the outcome that we're aiming towards? It's not to say that's a prescriptive form of higher education, but what is the end goal you're working towards? So you actually know what you're measuring. I think one of the challenges of the Hefke projects was they started with methodology, which is a really interesting position to start with, rather than, well, what's the purpose of what you're trying to measure? And I think there's really this need to start to work with students at every level of this in asking, well, what is the outcome? And students need to be part of that conversation. They should be answering that question. Why are you going to higher education? What do you want to achieve from your degree? That needs to be part of setting this sort of work up to think, well, what is it we're going to evaluate in the first place? And what does doing this well look like? And again, that's what I'm going to ask you to reflect on your own context and your own situation. What would doing, using learning gain data, using this kind of evidence for enhancement, what would that actually look like in your context? How would you know if you did it well? So I want you to kind of think about that and think, is there something you could do within your sphere of influence? It might not be able to change the entire university, but I think one of the things we pulled up from the projects is you could do this in the one guest lecture that you give. The 1 hour you have with students. You could do it in the module you could teach. You could do this in the processes that you run or that you administer or manage. So everyone's got a space to kind of think about, what students are learning and how can I prioritize that in the work that I do? And how can I make that a bit more explicit to know if I'm actually fulfilling those fundamental purposes of what higher education's for and about. Some kind of anecdotes of what people say you know, what does starting to do this well look like? I mean, I think I've been to some institutions where you start to go, you know, I think you're starting to make some headway on this. You talk to everyone and they talk about the same kind of principles and values. It's clear when they make decisions that they're reflecting on a clear principle. You talk to students and they actually, this strategic plan isn't just some sort of dusty document, you know, drawing up in someone's cupboard. It's actually a real thing that they feel part of. So there's ways that you can start to get a sense around a place if this is a real thing. And looking ahead. I call this the triangle of doom. I Googled it once, and it will literally give you a heart attack because it's about heart attacks. But data protection, as we know with, I mean, even before GDPR, but huge issues on how this data is used, you know, about students. Massive issues with data sharing across institutions, back with government. They actually still haven't cracked that one. Big challenge, and huge issues around ethics. Research ethics, ethics with students. Is it appropriate to do kind of a rank order of learning proficiency across the class and tell all the students? Is it helpful to tell students, you're at the bottom of the class? You know, these kind of duty of care to students are things we actually need to think about. And I don't think these are easily solvable. And I think the only way to get through it is to engage students in the processes, because we will never get around these ethics of how do we use students' data if we are just using it about them. We have to bring them into the conversation as the only way for students to feel that this isn't something that's being done to them. And we can't ask them at every step of the way, oh, hi, I want to analyze you this way, that way, this way, that way. They need to own those steps and be part of that. So that it's not ethics about students, it's very much ethics with students. And this is kind of my call to arms with a lot of social science researchers. There's a necessary balance, particularly when you think about things like learning gain data, about the precision we can measure things, what we mean about things like statistical significance and purpose and use and reporting and these really complex charts that people can do showing all sorts of lines, doing all sorts of different things, and what's practical to collect, and what's practical to use. I mean, some projects, bless them, they were like, we only have 250 questions on our instrument. I was like, no one's ever going to fill that out. But they were like, but we covered all the bases. And I was like, methodologically, brilliant. Practically, you get a 0. You know, so there's a balance in this, which means it's kind of a trade-off area, and it's never going to look as perfect as you want it to. It's never going to be as comprehensive as you want it to if you actually want to get something out in the end. Challenges of student engagement. I mean, the main finding from the project, it's really hard to get students to do this extra kind of work, whether it's tests or surveys, attending workshops, any of that. Students making sense of the data. I mean, loads of students actually even filled out the tests. They did these like hour-and-a-half long critical thinking tests, and then they were offered workshops to sort of walk through it, and none of them would go to the workshop. I was like, why'd you take the test then? You didn't even get the bonus bit. You know, this kind of danger of a pact of disengagement of like, well, I won't ask a lot of you and you don't ask a lot of me, but you get a nice degree, everyone's happy. You know, and I actually see learning gain as the thing that interrupts that dysfunctional relationship that can kind of happen between students and universities. And this is a real question for policymakers when we have this question of value for money. And it relates to this kind of pact of disengagement. Are we asking what students want, what they like, what might feel a bit easy? Or do we do the kind of eat your green leafy vegetables, what's good for them? What these pedagogical practices are. The example I always use in this case, giving class presentations. Students hate it. And they hate listening to other students present in addition to presenting themselves. But guess what's really nice? People having presentation skills. It makes the world a better place. So where do you do that? If you ask students, they're never going to sign up for it. But you may say, actually, I think that's really good for you. And we think that's a valuable outcome from your degree that you should have. But student engagement, you knew we'd get to the good bits too. So it's not easy. And I think it's not easy when it's something that students don't understand and they haven't been part of it. And they're just handed something and they don't know what it means or what it's for. But there's huge opportunities for students to be part of planning what this looks like, part of the conversation, data gathering, data analysis, data sharing. I mean, I've had brilliant success of running internships with students, analyzing things like qualitative comments in the NSS, and coming up with recommendations from a student point of view, reading student comments. And that's on a simple thing. But when we talk about learning gain, even richer. Students actioning that data, thinking about how it can be used for enhancement, what would change some of what's coming out in the data. And actually, when you ask students that question, they tend to come up with something that doesn't cost an FTE, which is always the staff solution to what do we need? I just need more people. Students actually come up with really creative, often free solutions. And students need to be part of this feedback and follow-up. So this needs to be part of the culture within an institution that students are part of. This can't be sort of something on the side. And as I always conclude, think about all of this work and think about engaging students with them. Challenge them on this. Students should be able to say, why are you here? They own it. They are in the classroom. They are online. They are part of this. This isn't something that institutions just do to make students happy. This is part of challenging students about the choices that they're making. But in challenging them, also support them, the kind of ethos of student affairs. Inform them about what's going on, keep them part of the feedback loops, provide opportunities for students that are clear and signaled, and hold them responsible. They need to own what's happening with their learning. It's not just something that's given to them. And this ethos of working with students in these efforts and not for them. I'll stop there so that we have some time for questions. The reports that I've referenced are all available online. I've tweeted links, so you can find them there, or you can Google on the OFS Learning Gain website. The reports are there if you want more detail on all of these projects. And I think Learning Gain data actually provides an avenue for us to truly actually put students at the heart of the system in a legitimate, kind of pedagogically informed way. If we do it right. It's never going to be done perfectly, but I think we've got a huge opportunity to get closer to that and not let it become something that we don't want it to be. So thank you very much.